Good morning to all of you, or good evening, depending where you are joining us from. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion focusing on the rise of digital authoritarianism and disinformation warfare in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar, and I'm looking forward to an exciting conversation. My name is Samara Kharroub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I will be moderating the discussion and I will provide some remarks of my own here in the introduction. So let's get to it. As many of you know, information and communication technologies have proven that they can play an important role in facilitating democracy and human rights activism. However, in the last decade or so, authoritarian and repressive regimes across the region have been heavily investing in cyber capabilities and digital strategies in order to ensure their regime survival and advance their geopolitical agendas. Not only are autocratic regimes using social media tools and surveillance technologies, and even weaponizing cybercrime laws to monitor, intimidate, and silence critics and human rights activists domestically, but they're also employing disinformation campaigns and online troll armies to influence and manipulate foreign populations in order to prop up dictators across borders, and in the process undermining democratic principles and human rights. For example, we've seen this happened several times. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates employed paid social media influence operations in support of the military in Sudan. In the same way in Libya, Egypt, UAE, along with Russia and Saudi Arabia, used social media campaigns to support General Khalifa Haftar and even attempting to overthrow the UN-backed government. In addition to domestic censorship and cross-border operations to provoke dictators, disinformation campaigns are being used to create doubt and uncertainty, largely by pumping conflicting and divisive narratives on social media and making it increasingly difficult for people to distinguish between fact and fiction online. And at the same time, intensifying polarization and sectarianization. And to go even a step further, the label of fake news is being weaponized to discredit human rights activists and critics and even victims. And we've seen many, like Israel and Russia, accusing victims of being crisis actors. So what we are facing now is an emerging information crisis. And in the near future, with the rapid advancements in technology, we will see more and more doctored images and deepfake videos looking realistic. In the MENA region, this is particularly problematic because press freedoms are poor or non-existent, and there is widespread distrust in government-controlled information. So we see many people rely on social media for their news. And in this context, we are quickly approaching an alarming information emergency. And in what we can now call the cyber power era, these cyber weapons are particularly powerful because they are relatively low cost but high impact. And for the most part, they tend to be an invisible part of a government's agenda and military arsenal. So in this context, it's becoming an increasingly emergency situation, not only for information and expression worldwide, but also for supporting democracy and human rights in the region. And so we at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. wanted to organize this important webinar to address the rise of digital authoritarianism in the Arab world and the alarming information crisis that the region is facing. What are the models and the toolkit of Arab digital authoritarianism? And what is the extent of the disinformation operations and cyber warfare tactics taking place across the region today? What is the role and the responsibilities, as well as the shortcomings of social media companies? What are the prospects, pros and cons of any attempt to regulate the tech industry? And what recommendations do we have to address the growing challenges posed by the misuse of digital and social media technologies? To answer all these questions, we have an excellent panel of experts who have taken the time to join us and share their insights. Thank you to all of you for being here. I will briefly introduce our panelists in speaking order. Marwa Fatafta is the MENA Policy Manager at Access Now. Muna Shtaya is a Palestinian digital rights defender and the advocacy advisor at Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. Alexei Abrahams, he's a data scientist at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. And Bayan Tel is a media communication specialist based in Jordan. Thanks to all of you for joining, and I look forward to your contributions. Quickly before we start, I want to remind the audience that you can send in your questions at any time during the discussion using the Q&A feature on Zoom. For those watching on our website and social media platforms, you can send your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org. Please indicate your name, affiliation, and to whom your question is addressed. And we'll try to take as many questions as possible within the time that we have. In terms of format, we'll have 2 rounds of questions for the panelists. In each round, each panelist will have about 5 to 6 minutes. In the first round, I will try to focus on the issues and the challenges that the region is facing. In the second round, we'll try to be a little bit more optimistic and try to offer some solutions and recommendations. And with that, I will start the discussion. I would like to start with Marwa. Marwa, can you outline the digital tools and methods being used by autocratic regimes in the MENA region to police political discourse, silence critics, and repress human rights activists and defenders? And the second part of this question, what is the role of social media companies in all of this? How are they enabling these practices? And what is their responsibility here? Marwa?
Thank you so much, Tamara, and hello, everyone. And thanks for the Arab Center for organizing this important discussion. So let me start by saying that, of course, the internet offers a space for citizens in the MENA region to express themselves. And of course, the Arab governments have quickly realized after the Arab revolutions that this is a space that they should control and monitor very closely. And they've done that through a number of tactics, the first one of which is the use of cybercrime legislation. So the government's approach to freedom of expression has been through criminalization. A number of countries in the MENA region have passed very repressive, overly broad cybercrime legislation whose aim is to crack down on dissent and prosecute individuals, journalists, and human rights defenders who express views that are not necessarily towing the party line. The most recent of which is in Tunisia in September. Also in Libya in September this year, the Libyan authorities passed the cybercrime legislation. The Tunisian government, actually the president, passed a decree 54 on cybercrime that also presents a lot of threat to freedom of expression in the country. Palestine, Syria, the UAE, and a bunch of other countries have passed similar legislations, and they continue to update them. The UAE, for example, was one of the first countries in the MENA region to pass cybercrime legislation, I think back in 2012. And earlier this year, they updated their law to include provisions on that criminalizes any public criticism or criticism of public policies, and also adding a category of criminalizing fake speech. You've mentioned the issue of disinformation, Tamara, which is indeed a big problem in the region and on social media platforms, most specifically. But then when you look at how governments define fake news and what fake news are, that we see, unfortunately, that this has become like a catch-all term that mainly targets human rights defenders, dissidents, journalists, and civil society actors. I mean, one of the most egregious examples that we have worked on this year, and I'm sure many have heard of, is the case of the Saudi woman. She's not even an activist. She's a student. She's a PhD student studying in the UK, a mother of 2 children, and she went on holiday to Saudi Arabia during Christmas break, and she was detained. She was forcibly disappeared first and then detained. And then in August, she was sentenced to 34 years in prison, followed by a 34-year travel ban under the cybercrime law and also the counterterrorism law, for charges related to tweeting to spread, sorry, not to spread misinformation, but to disrupt the public order. And also supporting those who seek to disrupt the public order. So these were her charges. And that's really pretty alarming, thinking of the future of freedom of expression in the region. The second tactic here is internet shutdowns. Access now works on internet shutdowns, and we document those as they take place. And for the last year, we've definitely witnessed a rise in digital authoritarianism, where governments just simply kill the switch when the conversation doesn't suit them, or whenever there are mass protests. One example is the Sudanese military coup that happened on the 25th of October last year. The authorities shut down the internet for almost a month, and that practice is not rare. It happens occasionally, at least in the MENA region. We've documented at least 23 shutdowns last year. Sudan is on top of the list. It shut down the internet at least 5 times. But we also see it in other countries like Jordan, Iraq, Algeria, Libya, even Tunisia. When the president dissolved the parliament, a number of parliamentarians decided to defy that decision and still hold their hearing session online. And then we noticed that both Zoom and Microsoft Teams video conferencing services were throttled. So throttling and internet shutdowns, this is also another, let's say, authoritarian tactic routinely used by governments in this region. And also just to say that, of course, governments realize the power of social media, but also the power of diaspora mobilization and transnational solidarity, and especially in the context of post-Arab Spring, where many people and activists and dissidents had already fled their countries, and they're now trying to mobilize and organize from abroad. And this is where the use of surveillance technologies and spyware comes in. Governments are not just happy with censoring and policing and prosecuting people who live within their jurisdiction, but they also want to know what the activists are doing abroad. And as we all know, the Pegasus scandal has been going on for a few years. The first use of Pegasus in our region was in 2016 by the UAE to hack the device of the Emirati human rights defender Ahmed Mansour. And since then, it's been one scandal after the other. We've had Palestinian civil society organizations hacked, Jordanian human rights lawyer Hala Ahed hacked in Jordan. Other technologies are, of course, used, and it's not only the use of spyware as such, which can be seen as cyber weaponry, but also utilizing or weaponizing or repurposing kind of day-to-day or special occasion types of applications. Like we've seen how, for example, during COP27, the Egyptian government rolled out a mandatory application, not really mandatory, but an application for participants, and it had a lot of backdoor access that is not necessary nor proportionate. And it was clear that the purpose of this app is just to monitor and gather as much information as they can about people that they deem targets. And this, I would say, is it's something I can make as a generalization, and especially in the past 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen all this dashing or rapid rolling out and deployment of certain technologies for citizens that do not respect the protection of personal data or the rights of privacy. And when you think of the future of our, let's say, digital infrastructures in the region, we see governments rushing to build these giga cities or mega cities, or smart cities, as in the case of Neom in Saudi Arabia, or the new administrative capital in Cairo, that is filled with surveillance cameras, that rolls out a lot of activities under the guise of trying to help citizens have better access to basic services, while the reality is they are building surveillance cities that will help them even monitor and crack down on people and further. And lastly, I want to mention here is, you've mentioned, Tamara, or tying back to your question about the role of social media companies. I mean, in the context of this heavy and entrenched authoritarianism, you really don't have much space as a citizen or as an activist to express yourself, except, of course, social media. And here, these platforms are kind of unreachable in terms of regulation, right? So governments can't just ask Twitter or Facebook or Instagram to remove pieces of content. They have ways to pressure platforms to do so. The Israeli government, for example, does provide voluntary requests to Meta and other social media platforms to remove content, but they can't really force them. Let's put it this way. And so the problem here is with the way that these companies bend to pressure, first of all, and then second of all is how they govern their speech on their own. So we're talking about platforms that enjoy a form of self-governance. They can decide single-handedly on the rules and the policies based on which they govern speech in the MENA region. They can also decide on how and when to enforce them. And that left us with a conundrum where political speech is often being censored and over-removed because of non-transparent policies, but also arbitrary forms of enforcement. And at the same time, disinformation, influence operations, coordinated and authentic behavior, gender-based violence, hate speech, most of the times in a number of contexts I've worked on, these campaigns remain unmoderated or remain for a long time on the platform until the company decides to take action. There are many reasons why companies do that. I think the most important reason is to put it very simply, at the risk of being, oversimplifying the problem, they don't care. It's an issue of resources. It's an issue also of political will, how much resources and attention you're allocating to be able to moderate content in many different dialects in the MENA region, and how fast you're able to do that, especially in a region that is marred in conflict and as you said, countries going through sensitive and difficult political trajectories. So I will end it here. I mean, I'm conscious of time, so I'm happy to expand further down the line. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Marwa, for this comprehensive overview, comprehensive yet alarming. And we'll definitely go back to these issues of social media companies and regulations in the second round of the questions. Next, I would like to move to Muna and focusing on Palestine and Israel. Muna, in the Palestinian context and in the absence of outlets for Palestinians to resist and tell their narratives, social media are one of the very few tools at their disposal to counter the Israeli disinformation campaigns. On one hand, social media affords marginalized and oppressed communities the tools to document human rights abuses and share their lived experiences and grievances with millions of people around the world. But on the other hand, we have a handful of for-profit corporations that essentially control expression and information, and they hold all the power to accessibility. Muna, if you could address this issue a little bit more, how have social media helped and hindered the Palestinian cause? And how are social media companies contributing to the censorship and silencing of Palestinian narratives? And the second part of my question is about the surveillance of Palestinians. Marwa mentioned NSO's Pegasus software, but we know there's many, many more. And Palestinians have been experiencing surveillance far longer and in far more extreme extent than people in who are citizens of the US or the EU, which largely attracted the attention of the international community. What is the impact of Israel's digital surveillance on the Palestinians? Muna?
Thank you, Tamara, and thanks for inviting me. So as you may know, Palestinians, among other communities around the world, or Palestinian cause have not or did not get much attention from the international mainstream media, or is not getting fair coverage from the international mainstream media for so many reasons, which basically open the opportunity for Palestinians when we think about the social media platforms as a new opportunity or as a chance to spread the narrative of Palestinians, to counter the Israeli propaganda, the disinformation, the fake news that the Israelis are spreading all the time. That's not something new. That's not something happening recently. That's happening for a very long time. But the most recent, or one of the recent cases, is the case of the veteran journalist Shirin Abu Akleh, who was killed last May. And as soon as she was killed by Israelis, the Israeli spokespeople, as well as their military officials, they were spreading fake news, disinformation, to tell the world that she was killed by a Palestinian gunman. And all the investigations by local human rights organizations such as Al-Haq, or Israeli human rights organizations such as B'Tselem, as well as international media organizations such as Al Jazeera, CNN, among others, were all confirmed that she was killed by the Israeli soldiers who were basically invading Jenin at that time. And she was killed by them. But social media platforms, unfortunately, did not take down or did not label any of this content that basically was spreading disinformation, despite the fact that we have escalated that. Hamle is a trusted partner for different social media platforms, and we use this platform to usually escalate cases where Palestinian content takedown is happening, or there's a censorship on Palestinian content. But at this time, we use it to escalate propaganda and disinformation to cover on Israeli crimes against Palestinians. But social media platforms did not respond. Basically, Meta, we escalated this case to Meta 2 or 3 times, and they didn't take action. They didn't label that post. They didn't even take it down. So this is alarming, and this can tell us more about how their policies is basically being implemented. And this is also just from one side on the disinformation. But if we also look at the general picture on how the Palestinian content is being moderated, it's also alarming. It's terrifying, since we are documenting an over moderation of the Palestinian content for years now. We've been trying to grab Meta's attention to this over censorship, which basically creates higher self-censorship on Palestinians on ourselves, but also as it created a change in narrative where Palestinians now are not basically writing their normal narrative as it should be done. They are changing the words, they are changing the narrative in order to manipulate or to play with the algorithms to keep the narrative online. So sometimes they are writing without dots, sometimes they are splitting the words with some symbols, sometimes they are using some English letters instead of some Arabic letters, like they are doing with the word Shaheed, or where they are doing with the word Muqawama, which means martyr, the first one, and the resistance for the second one. And this is basically means that even if you are an Arabic speaker and you are trying to search a word like Muqawama or Shaheed to check what's happening now in Palestine, you won't be able to know what's happening there because you can't find this word. Basically, we are changing how this word is written, and this created a self-censorship, a higher self-censorship among Palestinian activists as well as Palestinian journalists. Which means, if we just think about that, it basically means that as we see, or like despite the fact that we see social media platforms as an opportunity to spread this alternative narrative that is not basically covered in the international mainstream media, we are still censoring ourselves as a result of how social media companies are moderating our content. And we here can like mention certain policies that social media platforms are implementing, and it's disproportionate. For example, if we just look at how they are moderating the DOI policy, or the dangerous organizations and individuals, which is basically the Facebook or Meta we're not transparent about that. We've never seen this list published from Meta unless this year, or except this at the beginning of this year, when the Intercept, they published the leaked document of the DOI list on their website. And when we have, like, if you have a look at that, you can see how disproportionate is that. You can see that there are 48 Palestinian individual and organization are designated on that list. While if you look at the Israeli side, you can see only two, one Israeli individual and one Israeli organization. And the individual, he is the co-founder of the organization. And this basically means that it's disproportionate. If you just zoom out a little bit and look on the international scale, you can see that the most they are designating more individuals and groups from the Islamic and Arabic countries, and less from the European and American countries, which basically are regions, which basically means that this is disproportionate. It's US centric. It's built on the US centric, the US law, but it's also going beyond the law itself, because the law itself was built to counter terrorism on the ground. It was not built for the social media platforms, and they are now going beyond what the law is asking them to do, to design their policies inside the companies and to implement that. And keep in mind that they are over enforce those policies on Palestinians, among other marginalized and colonized communities around the world. And they are under moderating the others' narratives. We can also give an example on how the Israelis are spreading hate speech, incitement speech, and violent speech against Arabs and Palestinians on social media platforms. We also at Hamle are publishing the index of the hate speech, which is an annual index where we are monitoring the Israeli Hebrew conversations, and it shows how there is a gradually increasing in the hate speech, incitement, and violent speech against Arabs and Palestinians, and it stays online. And this speech is basically published in Hebrew. And the BSR report confirmed what we have been claiming for years. So this is basically how the content moderation and the social media companies are shaping our narratives on the online space. But if we just look at the other half of the question, which is the surveillance technologies, yesterday we at Hamle alongside...
Sorry to interrupt. Could you cover the surveillance a little quickly?
Yes, sure. Of course. So yesterday, we at Hamle alongside our European partners launched a campaign called Palestinians Under Surveillance, or Life Under Surveillance, to cover how Palestinians feel living under surveillance, because surveillance, basically Palestinians are living under surveillance state, or a multi-layered surveillance system, where we are now trapped with the CCTV cameras, with the drones, with the biggest spyware among other spywares. We're talking about CCTV cameras in very and not only on the military checkpoints, but also in our public spaces, in our streets. And some women in Jerusalem, they confirm that they are putting their hijab on their head inside their homes because they don't feel safe, and they feel that those CCTV cameras are invading their personal space inside their homes. And we can also mention the blue wolf and the white wolf, which basically works or used to collect more data about Palestinians and to profile Palestinians as a tool to make the population control easier for them. And this means that they are testing their surveillance and spying technologies on Palestinians before selling that worldwide and before exporting authoritarianism to other authoritarian repressive regime around the world. And we can also mention or highlight the MENA region, especially like the Gulf areas, Moroccan regime, among others. I'll stop here, but I would be happy to expand on that later on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mona, for this. And next we have Alexei, who will focus on civil society actors. Alexei, if you could give us a little bit more detail and elaboration on the digital and security challenges that are the civil society organizations and actors are facing in the region, and what's the impact of digital authoritarianism and disinformation on their work.
Okay, thank you, Tamara, for the opportunity, and I apologize to everyone for صوتي المبحوح اليوم عشان I tested positive for COVID last night, and so just bear with me, please. This is my first time with the virus, and it's pretty serious.
I'm just sorry to hear that, but I hope you feel better soon. And thank you for joining us despite not feeling very well.
No, I'm glad to be here. I'll just try to keep stay within my time. So I want to highlight two challenges to do with digital authoritarianism that would be nice to address here. One is that civil society organizations across the region are not yet protecting themselves as much as they could be. And so it kind of brings up the other side. There's a lot of conversation about the prowess and the ability of the authorities across the region to be able to hack and surveil and spy upon civil society. But I'd like to open the conversation about what civil society can do to protect itself and why it's not already protecting itself as much as it could be. The other aspect, which I think Marwa and Mona already touched upon, is obviously that social movements are increasingly intertwined with social media. They have a big presence on social media, and that's become a way by which the authorities can use disinformation against them, but also surveil them. So on this matter of insecurity of civil society, there's very little data to work from. So I just wanted to highlight a recent study that I conducted with a friend, Etienne Menier, who you all may know from Amnesty International. And Etienne and I developed a computer program that will scan websites and web servers and try to collect some basic data on the security of those sites and servers as a way of trying to generate some data on this question. And so we put together a list of 228 Palestinian civil society organizations, and we scanned all of them. And what we found was that many of the best practices you would expect for web security were lacking. So as you can see from this table, just 68% of these Palestinian organizations would even enable HTTP secure protocol when we're trying to access their site. And less than half, but 41.7%, would actually force HTTP secure. So that leaves a lot of opportunities for visitors to the websites of these Palestinian civil society organizations to have their web session monitored. And remember, this is in a context where Israel has a man-in-the-middle position over virtually all internet traffic going in and out of the West Bank or Gaza. Very minimal use of strict transport security. DDoS protection, distributed denial of service protection, was incredibly lacking. There was just one organization, I think it was Authoritarianism, that had enabled it. Many of the websites were using outdated versions of WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, and kind of shockingly to me, almost a quarter of the web servers were running outdated software for which there were publicly known vulnerabilities rated high or critical in severity. And so we were pretty shocked by this. And so we started to wonder, okay, well, why? What explains this? And one point is that it's not a technological issue. So there exists technical solutions for all of this, right? HTTPS, for example, it's a protocol that's been around for 20 years. It's been 10 years since Electronic Frontier Foundation made this big push, let's encrypt. And it's not like Palestinians don't know about this. Like if you look at their Zayd University's website, their security certificate is a Let's Encrypt EFF certificate. So, while we were preparing this paper, the Pegasus scandal that Marwa was alluding to erupted, and I think the conversation shifted to this issue of 0 days and the ability of the Israelis to do incredibly complicated and cutting edge hacking, cyber attacks. But frankly, that's impressive. But frankly, by analogy, these are much more quotidian issues that we're looking at here, and yet they aren't being addressed as yet. And so that, I think that raises questions. One explanation we thought that could account for the insecurity we're seeing was that, okay, perhaps it has to do with the NGOization of Palestinian civil society. So since the beginning of Oslo, and especially since the schism between Fatah and Hamas in 2007, there's been an infusion of aid from Western Europe and North America, and a lot of it has gone into the civil society sector, but has transformed the sector from a politically contentious set of organizations into more tame, neoliberal, technocratic NGOs. And so we thought perhaps these organizations we were scanning just don't anticipate being attacked by the authorities because they're not actually posing a political threat. So then when we thought, okay, well, let's scan a bunch of organizations that have publicly allied themselves with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, because that's an undeniably contentious movement. And surely organizations that publicly ally themselves with BDS will anticipate being attacked. In fact, the BDS movement main website was attacked in, I think, 2016 with the DDoS attack. So we scanned their sites, but as you can see from the stats to be found, sometimes they're better, but a lot of the times they're not. And it seems like being involved in contentious politics is not necessarily predictive. So anyway, we explored a bunch of explanations in the paper, and I can I can drop a link in the chat if people want to look at it. We settled on two plausible explanations. One could be digital literacy. It may just be that organizations are simply unaware of the kinds of vulnerabilities that they're leaving open. And then the other concern, I'd love to hear the other panelists and audience reflection on this, but the other concern is perhaps rational fatalism, that in some sense, Palestinians look at the power of a cyber adversary like Israel, and this is probably true of other civil societies around the region, considering the sophistication of state intelligence services. And they just say, well, if they want to surveil me, they're going to manage somehow. So in some sense, what's the point of trying to enable HTTPS or whatever it might be? So I don't know if that's what explains it. I'm sure I'm already over time. So I'll talk about social media on the next round of questions.
Okay, thank you, Alexei, for this. Very new information to me, at least. It's interesting to see what you've been working on. Next, we'd like to turn to Bayan. Bayan has been diligently working on, and Alexei mentioned digital literacy, and Bayan has been working on media literacy and digital literacy programs, at least in Jordan. Bayan, turning to that aspect, which is at the user's end, because we know these disinformation operations and attacks and targeted surveillance and so on, to some extent can be successful because the user's vulnerabilities or being susceptible to them, or in terms of disinformation, they exploit already existing sentiments and fears and sectarian tensions. And so just if you want to a little bit give us an overview of that part of disinformation campaigns, which is at the user's end, and why is media literacy and digital literacy important in this context?
Great, thank you, Tamara. I'm so happy to be with you. And I'm so happy that Alexei mentioned digital literacy. We call it media and information literacy because it has to do with not just media, but also the information. And which is basically when we approached the subject, when we started the project in Jordan in 2016, it was basically understanding. First, we tried to understand the media landscape and try to understand the amount or the frequency of disinformation and misinformation that is available, that is being circulated in Jordan, and the sources of that disinformation, and why is disinformation spreading so quickly among not just Jordanians, but across the world. And of course, a lot of research has been done on that. But basically in our part of the world, in the Arab world, it is mainly because of a few things. Number one, lack of trust between people and governments, between people and parliaments and their representatives, and between people and the media. So all this created this distrustful environment that gave way for disinformation to spread. It is also lack of governments or authorities' appreciation of communication, communicating with the public, and providing information. So people have no access to information, and this gives way to disinformation to spread even further. Another thing would be the lack of action by media organizations themselves, and the fact that they are controlled by authorities and by governments, but also because they've fallen prey to populism and have become more more tuned towards being popular online, the likes and the popularity and all that, rather than protecting their own profession from being manipulated by authorities. And so this has created, of course, the fact that misinformation and disinformation is created with a lot of effort. There is a lot of creativity involved in creating disinformation, and they appeal to our instincts, they appeal to our biases. On the other hand, there is no other narrative that actually challenges this information. And so, and especially with confirmation bias, which means that we tend to share and like and accept anything that agrees with our convictions, our values, in total disregard of other things. So with media and information literacy, we decided this will be a huge opportunity for people to become critical thinkers. The way we approach the whole thing is we developed manuals and material that is very interactive, exercise-based, and mainly the people who are undergoing the training tend to create their own, understand it through their own experiences. So it is not the usual way of training. So and that has created a huge difference in the people, the target audience that we work with. We could see the results immediately. And Alexei alluded to a very important thing is, why are these organizations not doing anything about their insecurity? And this applies to individuals as well. People don't know. They didn't know the basic privacy settings on their Facebook pages or other accounts. Basic information they were not aware of. So we developed the material to respond to all these challenges or lack of information available to people. And we worked on different levels. We worked with politicians, with legislators, with women, with youth, with students and teachers, of course. And so the material was developed in terms of, and it was to respond to the needs that we could see were more of a priority than others. At the time that we started, it was more important for people to understand the messages, because many Jordanians were being recruited online through terrorist organizations and were being fed messages that they were convinced of and believed. So it was important for people to understand how the messages are created, who's behind the message, who owns the organization or the media or the tool, and basically analyzing all that. We also focused on ethics. Social media is toxic. We see a lot of, and my colleagues Marwa and Muna, of course, alluded to all that, and Tamara, the stereotyping, the racism, the hate speech, the misogyny, and it's all there, and it's happening with amazing frequency. So it was important to help people understand. Many politicians were delivering messages that contained hate speech, especially against migrants in Jordan, without realizing that this is what they were doing. And so it was basically a lot of work. Not just us. I mean, I'm talking about civil society organizations also participating in that effort, and many countries involved. We worked with Palestine, we worked with Tunisia, we worked with Lebanon, and we could see that they all had the same need and the same priorities, especially concerning disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you so much, Bayan. And we'll move to the next round of questions, and hopefully we can address some of these challenges and try to provide some recommendations in a way to, hold big tech accountable, hold governments accountable, and look at some of the options that have been proposed. We'll start with Marwa, and maybe we can briefly talk about Twitter because it's been the biggest thing in the news after Elon Musk took over. In a sense, we know that Musk identifies as a libertarian. He's a free speech absolutist, and his worldview is very limited and very US-centric in a way that, it's the narrative of the liberal far left media silencing conservative voices. And that's where all of his policies are coming from. But how does that impact digital authoritarianism and uses of Twitter outside the US, and specifically in the Middle East and North Africa? And what recommendations do you offer for checking the power of tech companies in this context? What are your views on regulations and so on? We don't have as much time as we thought we would, so if you can be a little bit more concise, that would be great. Marwa, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara. I'll try my best to be as succinct as I can. I mean, first of all, on Musk's takeover, let's remember this is a platform that was infiltrated by the Saudi government back in 2014-15, where the personal data of dissidents were siphoned by internal employees to the Saudi government. We're talking about activists and dissidents who use the platform anonymously. Their real names, date of birth, IP addresses, messages, all of that was funneled to the Saudi regime. And once Musk took over the platform and turned it into a private company, it's important to note that the Saudis are the second shareholder of Twitter. So that, of course, raises a lot of concerns and question marks around the safety of users and the safety of their information. I don't think that Twitter at this point is a safe platform. The most evident example we've seen is how two so-called journalists have released dubious information from inside of Twitter, dubbing them as the Twitter files. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but the most alarming part for me was how did these two individuals have access to this information? And some of the screenshots that were shared by these two individuals showed that whoever had access to, let's say, Twitter's dashboard could access the private or the direct messages of individuals, of users. So there are concerns around access to users' communications and access to their personal information. The second point is, of course, as you mentioned, Tamara, it's around Musk's own understanding of content moderation and freedom of expression. He sees it mainly from a US-centric lens. He thinks that he said before acquiring the platform that everything will be done according to the law. And then, of course, the question you ask is, which law? Because if you look, as we already discussed for the MENA region, if the Saudi government provides him a judicial order, which, for example, in the case of Salma al-Shihab that I mentioned earlier, a part of her sentence is to deactivate her phone number and to also have Twitter suspend her account. So this gives us, of course, a glimpse into what governments can, for example, submit to Twitter as judicial order. These are dubious and unfair due process and trials. And then he can safely say, well, this is a government order and I'm just complying. The third danger around Musk taking over and what that means for digital rights in the MENA region is the fact that he gutted Twitter. He fired half of Twitter staff. He fired the human rights team that is responsible for ensuring that Twitter is compliant with their human rights obligations. Last night, they dissolved the Trust and Safety Council. That was an advisory council of civil society organizations and human rights experts who worked with Twitter to provide information and feedback on some of their policies and trust and safety measures. We've even come to the point that the head or the former head of the Trust and Safety Council apparently had to flee his own home because of death threats. So the fourth last point on Twitter, just commenting quickly, is sorry, I lost the point. So we talked about content the content moderation. So the fact that of course, you know, we're talking about a situation where, at least in the MENA region, you know, we have been disadvantaged in the sense that we haven't had enough content moderation reviewers, enough resources to ensure that their policies are applied sufficiently. Hate speech, disinformation is addressed on time. And with the current situation and the thinning down of Twitter as a platform, we're not sure we would be able to receive the support we need from this platform. And the fact that Musk is the sole director of Twitter while wearing multiple business hats makes him susceptible to government pressure. If the Saudi government tells him, if Musk, for example, wants to open a Tesla factory or business in Saudi Arabia, and then they tell him, well, of course, we're happy to, but on the condition of, I think, of course, we don't know whether he's going to comply or not, but the fact that there are no checks and balances, the fact that there are no other systems to ensure that he doesn't do that. You know, the board of directors is gone. Taking the company private means that he's kind of less answerable to public scrutiny, et cetera, et cetera. So at the moment, it's not a safe place. And of course, the golden question you've asked is, what can we do? And unfortunately for our region, we don't want governments to regulate. Like, this is a territory where we want actually Arab governments to stay far away from. But there are some promising initiatives. I mean, the EU's Digital Services Act just came into effect last month. And there are some interesting components for us when you think about regulation to kind of size down or contain the outsized power of tech platforms, the most important of which is mandatory due diligence. So for example, when these companies decide on content moderation policies or content removals or account suspensions, that everything should be done based on human rights and based on proper human rights due diligence and meaningful participation with civil society to ensure that whatever decision you make does not impact people, and especially marginalized communities like in Palestine and elsewhere, negatively. The second thing is that we need more transparency. I mean, the self-regulation form of governance hasn't really worked. We can trust the good intentions of platforms, but even as we've seen with the case of Twitter, they can change hands. They can have a new owner, and the new owner can shut down all the great work that has been previously done. So we need transparency to become mandatory. Transparency of the algorithms being used, including for content moderation, including, you know, whether they are accurate or not. Are they resulting in no censorship, like the case in Palestine? Transparency around government requests for content removal and users' data. So maybe just to summarize, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and this is a really, let's say, a complicated decision that requires a lot of nuance, but any form of regulation should focus on processes and not on types of content that should be taken down, which is exactly what governments in the MENA region are doing. You know, a lot of disinformation during COVID. How do you tackle that? You criminalize the spread of disinformation. That has been the course of action of governments in the region. What we're saying is that you should focus on regulating the processes of the platform to ensure that they put human rights at the center by law and not just by good intentions or good faith actions. And this, of course, avoids the discussion around what is legal speech or illegal speech, especially because many governments around the world have different laws and regulations on what constitutes illegal content. So I will stop here, but if there are any questions from the audience, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Marwa. That's a great point, focusing on processes and not content when looking at regulations. Next, we move to Muna, and back to the context of Palestine. You mentioned, Muna, the BSR report, which was commissioned by Meta, and it concluded that there was bias in over-moderating the Palestinian content. Can you tell us a little bit about, how significant this report is, and can it be really useful? Are the recommendations being enforced, or is it just a cosmetic thing that Meta does? How should tech companies be forced to prevent this type of bias and censorship?
Thank you, Tamara, for your question. So just before answering your direct questions, there are a couple of points that I should point out before, which is for a very long time, civil society organizations were demanding Meta to have this kind of due diligence report on how they are moderating their Arabic and Hebrew content on their platforms. And they never took that on a serious matter, or they never accepted our recommendation, despite the fact that they are always claiming that they have engagement with the civil society among other stakeholders. And this is really heartbreaking for civil society organizations when we recommended that, and when we made engagement with the oversight board who was investigating on a specific case that came on the background of the May uprising last year for Al Jazeera journalist, the Egyptian journalist, who also faced content censorship on Meta's platform. And as a result of that, we all recommended them that there should be a human rights due diligence. And as a result of that, the oversight board recommended this recommendation to Meta, which we should highlight that the recommendations of the oversight board are non-binding for Meta, so Meta can accept them and can decline them. But fortunately, they accepted that, and they conducted, or they hired the third party independent party, which is the BSR, Business Social Responsibility Network, to conduct this human rights due diligence. And the other point is this human rights due diligence came with nothing new, because we for a long time were pointing out we're trying to grab Meta's attention about this problem of over moderating the Arabic Palestinian content and under moderating the Israeli Hebrew content, among other problems, as I mentioned in the last question, about the DOI policy, about the delegates, about other issues that we usually were trying to grab their attention and to tell them more about. And this report, unfortunately, it said that there is a bias. It confirmed the bias against Palestinians on Meta's platform. But unfortunately, it said that this bias is unintentional. And it's a bit weird to point on something for so many years and then it came out as unintentional bias. It's a bit like the technical glitch that they usually claim that it's just a technical glitch. And when we see other people and how their content is being moderated, it's totally different. And this could take us into a bigger point of view on how social media companies are working on which base and which interests, because obviously there are this political, economical interests that social media companies are following. For example, in the case of Russia, Ukraine, they also follow the political, economical interests of bigger governments. For example, the US government, and they took a side with the Ukrainian people, despite the fact that it was very late, because the civil society there was pointing out this problem for so many years and they never took action. But whenever they took the action, it was really strict measures to protect the occupied people, or the Ukrainians. But in the case of Palestine, this has been happening for years now, and they never took strict action. And even when the report came out, till now, like we didn't hear anything. Like we're still having meetings and engagement, but we didn't have a timeline on how they are going to implement those recommendations. They announced their response to the reports, which basically rejected also one of those 21 recommendations, which is crucial and should be accepted. And as civil society, we might not accept all, or we might not agree with all of the recommendations, but we accept them because they hired a third independent institute to do that. But they themselves, Meta itself, they rejected one of those recommendations, unfortunately. So the issue is, if it's unintentional bias, then they should work really hard to end on this unintentional quote unquote bias, so we can enjoy this digital space, so we can spread the narrative of Palestinians as others are doing on a free, fair digital space. But unfortunately, delaying that or delaying issuing their implementation timeline would also took us or funnel us again in next crisis, God forbid, that we will be also discriminated against. Until now, we are still documenting digital rights or content censorship on Meta's platforms, on Facebook, on Instagram, among others, where Palestinian content is being taken down or censored, and those cases are false positive cases, which means they are documentation of a human rights violations. So it is useful because it confirmed what we have been pointing out for years, but it means nothing if they didn't take strict measures to end this bias and to follow their human rights principles, or the human rights and business principles, as well as the international human rights law, to non-discriminate against any group or against any communities. And the last thing is this, which is very important. This report confirmed that this bias is basically affecting Palestinians' right to free speech, Palestinians' right to gathering and assembly, Palestinians' rights to non-discrimination, among other rights, and to political participation. And in one of our reports in Hamle, we documented that 2/3 of Palestinian young people are not sharing their political opinions on the social media platforms because they have the chilling effect of being censored or monitored. So this is the chilling effect. It didn't come out of the blue. It came from the censorship from the social media platforms, as well as the Israeli censorship on the Palestinians and Palestinian young people whenever they are spreading something on the social media platforms. I'll stop here because I'm conscious in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. We are getting close to the end, and I want to get in a couple of questions from the audience. We do have somewhat of a complaint that these solutions are not really solutions. They have issues with them, and clearly, there's no magic answer to all of these issues. There are pros and cons to every solution, but we'll move to Alexei next, and he may have some viable solutions, at least for civil society organizations, how to protect themselves. Alexei, go ahead.
Thank you, Samara. So I'll share my screen again. Great. Okay, so the the solution that I'm just going to suggest here is that civil society can actually surveil itself, and that might sound a little bit strange, but it's a very accepted idea in the field of cybersecurity, that the way that you achieve cybersecurity defense is you actually scan and surveil your own networks and devices, and you try to hack yourself, basically, to figure out where your own weaknesses are so that you can patch them before they're exploited by a malicious actor. And so if we go back to that web scanning tool that Etienne and I coded, we are very happy to turn this over to Palestinian civil society and any other civil society in the region, really, so that they can routinely, say on a daily basis or weekly basis, scan the websites and web servers corresponding to their organizations to see if the software that they're using is falling out of date and are there any vulnerabilities that they don't know of, and so they can have a moving picture of their security. And so the other angle in this, though, is to monitor social movements on social media. So as we've discussed, social movements and social media are incredibly intertwined now. And that's bad from the point of view of being surveilled from governments, because governments can collect massive amounts of data on these social movements and then make inferences about them and recognize weaknesses and so on. But it's also an opportunity. Social movements can monitor themselves. They can collect data on their own campaigns and on their discourses and communities around them, and they can recognize they can calculate different, let's say, health indicators about their movement, and then address issues as they arise. So one idea came to me from a very old study where an anthropologist was interviewing members of a karate club back in the early 1970s, and he asked each of these members to tell him, who are your friends within the club? And then after asking a bunch of people, he drew this map, and it became apparent that within this club, there were really two clubs. There were a bunch of friends, the green ones here, and then also a bunch of the orange ones. And they had very few friendships across each other, but friendships within. And sure enough, 3 or 4 months after these interviews, the club actually broke apart. They had disagreements, and they just turned into two clubs roughly along these lines. And so imagine you applied the same kind of thinking to a social movement. And you said, well, our social movement is made up of many different factions. We're unified by a common desire. For example, if Palestinians have many different factions. I'm working on a paper right now with Dan al-Kurd and Nasser al-Masri, and Dana put together some lists of different different prominent Twitter users within the Palestinian community, but sorted according to different categories. So I don't know if you can see here, but the voices from within Palestine, within 48, Palestinians who have a rather sympathetic view of Bashar al-Assad, Palestinians from Gaza, the West Bank and Jerusalem, Palestinian organizations, Palestinians in the diaspora. So she created different lists of Twitter handles. And what I've done here is I've plotted for the past month, we've been tracking them all year, but I've plotted for you for the past month their retweeting behavior. And so something you can tell, for example, is the Islamist Palestinians primarily retweet each other. 70% of their retweets are actually of other Islamists. And if you look at the other categories, very few other Palestinian groups retweet the Islamists. I'm seeing a lot of zeros down this column, very, very small numbers. So that says to me that the Islamists are isolated, which is not something that's going to surprise anyone on this panel. But my point being that you can look at social media data and make inferences about the health of your movement. Here, looking at the concentration of influence within the Palestinian discourse. Back earlier from January 2021, we see a fairly large percentage of Twitter users account for most of the influence, but of late it's become very concentrated. Just less than 10% of of Palestinian voices are dominating the discourse. So that could be something to consider. I should also say that I found that among those different factions within the Palestinian discourse, actually the ones who are sympathetic to Bashar al-Assad are some of the most influential. That community is most influential among all of these other communities, which is something to consider, because those who are supportive of Bashar al-Assad often propagate and buy into all kinds of conspiracy theories and disinformation about the Syrian revolution and so on. And you can also look at the trajectory of different individual members in the community. So this is looking at Muhammad al-Kurd from Sheikh Jarrah, and you can see that Muhammad was one of the highest ranked Palestinian voices back in 2021, and particularly during the Sheikh Jarrah crisis, he was in the top 20 highest page ranked users. Of late, somewhere around April of this year, he really lost a lot of influence and has not broken the top 100 in a number of months. And so you can ask why that might be and what's going on there. Anyway, so my point is, it's possible to look at these data and assess the health of the social movement. And I'm doing this right now with my co-authors, but what I would really like is for Hamle and other organizations and activists within the community to actually be using these data and monitoring the movement to achieve a kind of a self-awareness and be able to anticipate issues before they arise.
Thank you, Alexei. It's an interesting way of looking at this issue. And next, we have Bayan, last but not least. Going back to the issue of media literacy, we do have a couple of questions that I would like to integrate into my last question here from the audience. They're asking about whether US and EU aid has been supporting those media literacy programs, and I know you have some experience with that, Bayan, but also about whether there are demographic differences in when you look at media literacy, age, gender, and so on. And if you could just, people are asking about these manuals that you've developed. Are they accessible online? What type of media literacy programs does the Arab world need, and how are they implemented in your experience? Go ahead, Bayan.
Thank you. Great. I'll be very brief. Yes, we did get support from the EU. The first project that we implemented was funded by the European Union, and it was in collaboration with UNESCO. UNESCO has developed many manuals. They're available online, and you can access them, and they're in several languages, and they're for teachers. And I think they developed something more recently. You will find them all there and available. The manuals that we developed are homegrown and based on our needs, and some are available online. You may find them on the Jordan Media Institute website. The one that we developed like an outline of an integration strategy for media literacy into curriculum from grades KG2 to 12 in Jordanian schools. The outline is available on the National Center for Development of Curricula in Jordan. And we're currently working on the actual integration, but this document is not available yet. We're still working on that. From my experience, I think without international support, without civil society organizations coming together, none of the work can be done. it's very important that we create a critical mass where we create, where we advocate for the right for people to access information, the right for people to express themselves freely, and for a free press. And we should be adamant about this, because without this, there will be no progress in any part of our world. It has to happen. And we have to address the problems, the challenges facing education. What we're doing is not education. Basically, we need to reinvent education. And with what's happening online and the digital revolution, I think we need to just completely shift into something completely different. So we have to think out of the box about education. Until then, I think, and until we fight our battles with the social media platforms, it's very important that we continue to provide the skills that people need to navigate all this and to discern, and to be available. These skills should be available for everyone across all genders, all social and age groups, and we have the ability to do that. And education, we need to reform education and journalism education. Media journalism schools are not doing the work they're doing. We did a study about Arab journalism schools, and none of them were actually providing the training and the capacity building and the information that journalists need to be able to do their job properly. And I guess, yeah, that's it. Basically, education.
Thank you, Bayan, for this. We have a few minutes left. So what I'm going to do is read a few questions that are coming in from the audience, and then give each of our panelists 1 or 2 minutes to answer any questions they would like to answer, and give their concluding remarks. So just quickly, we have a question from Will Gant. I'm just going to read. Do social media companies have different rules for different countries? Did the regional offices share the personal information of online critics with foreign governments? We have a question from Jerome Glenn about satellite internet access, like SpaceX, which we're going back to Elon Musk now. But do these counter government control? That's the question. Question about evidence of outsourcing disinformation operation, if there's evidence. We have a question from ACW Executive Director Khalil Jahshan. He's asking, is the gap between governmental desire for control over social media versus public desire for freedom still bridgeable at this advanced stage? Do you see a significant difference in this regard between the Arab version of the gap and its counterpart in the West in general? Maybe I can do one more question from Dane Yu, PhD student at Georgetown University. How much does the public really aware about repressive legislation being enacted, like the cybercrime legislation? Is it publicized? Is it clear? And you've mentioned a little bit about how vague the definitions are, Marwa. So these are the questions that we have time for. We have about 6 minutes left, so I'll give each of you a minute and a half to answer whichever questions that you feel more strongly about, and give some concluding remarks. And I think we can maybe do a reverse order here. So we'll start with Bayan, if you have any comments on these questions or any concluding remarks from your end. You're still on mute, Bayan.
Sorry, no, I think I'm okay. I'm done. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bayan.
Yeah,
Alexa?
Sure. So I'm actually typing answers in the channel, if that's okay. I will just say on the satellite issue, I haven't thought about that before. It's an interesting thought, and I wonder if it creates the same situation in which, just like the social media platforms are served from outside of the region, and so they provide some kind of independence, but there's also, it's not total independence because the authorities can still pressure the platforms to conform to certain standards, or they can invest in them in some way that makes them prominent shareholders. I wonder if the same would become true with a satellite solution. But that's an interesting question. I'm going to think about that.
Okay, and do you have any concluding remarks? Because I just want to note that the answers you type are only seen by the person who's asking the question. So if you have any concluding remarks here, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize that. That's too bad. Okay, well, I'm going to, is there a way for me to drop in the general chat the link to links to some of the studies that I've been referencing? If
you want to say them live, and I think people will be able to search for them online.
Sure. Okay. So broadly summing up, I think there's been an emphasis on how digital authoritarianism is terrifying, and the authorities have more power than ever to surveil and repress, and that's all true. But it is also just technology. Civil society can also leverage this technology. We can surveil ourselves and recognize our own weaknesses before they're exploited. And we can be more, we can be proactive about this. There are things that we can do, like enabling HTTPS, for example, which is just, it's not, it's not a panacea. It protects you from one particular type of attack, but it's something we can do. We don't have to wait for Brussels or Washington, D.C. to give approval or send funding, right? It's something we can do. So there's agency, there is agency to Middle Eastern civil societies, to Palestinian civil society. We don't have to wait for, and we don't have to take our cue from outside actors.
Thank you, Alexei. That's a very practical solution that can be taken by individuals and organizations. Next, Muna, any answers that you want to address the questions in, or concluding remarks?
I think the question of the bridging the gap is really interesting, because if we just have a look, we can see how companies or corporates are putting hand in hand with authoritarian governments and generally with regimes and governments around the world to either by saying that they are following their laws or to fulfill their political, economical interests. And there's a huge gap between what people need and what those governments need, as well as what those corporates need. So I think there's still a room to push back, but we as organizers, human rights defenders, academics, as well as generally civil society organizations should join the forces, stand shoulder by shoulder with each other to push back on those authoritarian legislations as well as policies, to set the borders on what we need and to pressure them to follow the international human rights law. It's not an easy mission, but I think there's still a way that we can do that, but it's a hard mission. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. Marwa, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. And I have a bunch of answers. Maybe I'll start with the Elon Musk satellite question, because that's a very interesting one. The short answer is it's not a solution. We've seen how the Ukrainian government has relied on Starlink to have access to the internet when Russia invaded Ukraine. And then when it was not convenient for Musk anymore, he pulled out. And that shows you how fragile relying on billionaires for essential internet infrastructure is. In some other countries, let's say, for example, Iran, if you want to provide satellite internet, you actually need equipment in the country. And in some countries, this is not accessible. So you need, the service provider needs to have access. And in most cases, those who have can grant the access our governments. So I'm not sure to what extent this will be helpful in terms of internet shutdowns, not to mention that it's extremely expensive. It costs tens of thousands of euros or dollars to operate on a daily basis. And so it's not really a viable option, but it's probably something to explore. On the difference between social media platform rules, the short answer is no. The rules apply to everyone, but there's nuance in how platforms apply them. I'll give you, for sure in our region, and Muna explained in full detail how Meta's rules apply to Palestinian speech versus Hebrew language speech. Also, we've seen in different crises, different measures being afforded to different communities. So, for example, for Ukrainians, they were given a lot of exceptional carve-outs in their policies that would allow them, for example, to praise neo-Nazis, neo-Nazi battalions that are part of the Ukrainian National Guard. Such carve-out was never afforded, for example, let's say to Syrians or that have been victims of Russia, or to Palestinians for that matter. So same rules, but the way they're applied are different. On the question between the gap and whether it's bridgeable, I think in an ideal world, in a utopia, I think international human rights law provides very clear rules on how to balance between governments' national security and public order and their obligation to protect people's rights, and particularly the rights of freedom of expression. So I think in terms of regulation, when we talk about drafting laws, it is possible. It might be difficult, might be complex, but it is possible. But of course, governments are not interested in that. So the gap will remain wide. And the last answer to the question on cybercrime law, unfortunately, let's say the public is not really aware of what might come their way in terms of if they would be prosecuted under cybercrime law. Let me give you a very concrete example. So if you're criminalizing speech, it should be so definite and so specific that people know how to, behave and how to conduct themselves online and offline. And because these laws are drafted in such a vague way, they can be easily interpreted and misinterpreted to however the governments want them to do. One very unfortunate example of this is in Egypt, back in 2020, when the Egyptian government convicted, I think, 9 TikTok women. They were TikTok influencers, and they weren't even activists. It was just non-political speech to violating family values under the cybercrime law, and they were sentenced to disproportionate time in prison. And even after appeal, some of them were charged and imprisoned under human trafficking charges. So unfortunately, the public isn't aware, and there's no way, even if you want to dig into the law, to understand what are your responsibilities are as a citizen and what are the red lines according to this law, unfortunately. So I will end on this note, and thank you, Tamara, and everyone for this fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Marwa, and thanks everyone. We are over time, so we'll have to end here. But this has been a very, very interesting and insightful discussion, and there's definitely more to be said and discussed. But on behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I would like to thank all the speakers, all of you, for your time, for your insightful contributions, and for this excellent conversation. I would also like to thank our audience for tuning in. Just as a note, the video of this webinar will be available on our website later today. So please stay in touch and follow our work at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you again to all the speakers and the audience, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Take care.